A woman is dragged through the cobblestone streets with nothing to protect her, while her own children, confused, terrified, and pressured by the crowd, are pushed into throwing stones at her. Her so-called crime began as nothing more than a rumor. No hearing, no evidence, just a whisper that instantly turned neighbors into judges and executioners, and that was only the beginning. What followed was so shocking that even the priests who supervised these rituals were said to have turned away in disgust. This isn't a story invented for drama. Events like this happened thousands of times across medieval Europe. The punishments created during this era were so psychologically destructive that some modern researchers still study them to understand the mechanics of fear and control. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you the real records, laws, testimonies, and first-hand descriptions that reveal a system of punishment engineered to intimidate entire communities. It was deliberate, it was theatrical, and it was brutal enough that modern horror feels mild by comparison. And here's the part most people struggle to accept. The people who built this system weren't cartoon villains. They were respected leaders, priests, magistrates, husbands, elders, who believed they were enforcing divine order. By the end of this video, you'll understand why one historian described this era as the most organized assault on the female body in European history. And be warned, some of what you're about to hear crosses boundaries you might never have imagined existed. Before we get into the details of the punishments, you need to understand the framework behind them. This wasn't random violence. It was a controlled machine, a code of social discipline that stretched from snow-covered villages in the north to sunlit towns in the south. In medieval Europe, a woman's body legally wasn't considered her own. The moment she married, she became what legal scholars called femme couverte, a woman covered by her husband's identity. She was treated as part of his household property, and like property, any harm done to her was legally considered harm done to him. So when a woman was accused of infidelity, it wasn't viewed only as a moral failure. It was treated like a form of theft. She was accused of corrupting lineage, threatening inheritance, disrupting alliances between families, even destabilizing political agreements. And because this world had no DNA tests or official birth records, a man's only guarantee that his heirs were truly his came from controlling his wife's sexuality completely. A single accusation could call an entire bloodline into question. In their eyes, the threat was enormous, and the punishments were designed to match that fear. But these punishments weren't aimed at one woman alone. They were staged to terrify every woman watching. They were meant to create memories so sharp and humiliating that no one would ever dare cross the boundaries again. The cruelty was intentional, the spectacle was the message, and the people who enforced this? They weren't considered evil by their communities. They were ordinary neighbors who had been taught their whole lives that such violence wasn't only justified, it was righteous. The punishment considered merciful was something called the carting or the penance walk. The name sounds harmless, almost gentle, but the reality was a calculated psychological attack. It began with the shaving. Imagine you're a woman in a German town in the 1300s. Before sunrise, the bailiff and his men burst into your home. They make sure your family sees everything as they drag you outside to a small wooden stool in the public square. A barber, maybe the same one who has groomed your husband for years, steps forward with shears, but he's not there to tidy your hair. According to historical records from Augsburg, barbers were instructed to make the haircut as uneven and humiliating as possible. They left clumps behind, carved rough patches, and made the woman appear disfigured or unclean. One account from 1487 describes a woman begging them to at least cut it evenly. The crowd laughed. Her suffering was their entertainment. Hair in medieval culture symbolized beauty, dignity, and womanhood. A married woman's covered hair represented modesty and status. Shaving it wasn't just punishment, it was erasing her identity. It was a visual declaration that she no longer belonged to the community of respectable women. Then came the forced stripping. Some regions allowed a thin undergarment. Others, especially parts of France and England, required complete nudity by law. Public nakedness wasn't only shameful, it was considered spiritually corrupting. A woman exposed like this was thought to bring misfortune or impurity simply by passing through a space. Next came the procession. She wasn't taken down unfamiliar streets. She was marched past the places that defined her life. Her home, her church, the market where she greeted friends, the houses of people she'd known since childhood. And everyone had to come out and watch. In many towns, refusing to witness these punishments resulted in fines. So neighbors, friends, even family members were forced to participate. Crowds did more than stare. Court records describe people throwing not just spoiled vegetables but stones, mud mixed with waste, even small dead animals. A 1342 entry from Tuscany reports a woman losing an eye to a thrown object. Another record describes a pregnant woman who miscarried after the procession. Authorities never stopped the crowds. This was the point. The walk could last hours, sometimes 6 or 7, through heat, through freezing rain, through any condition. Some women fainted, others broke down mentally, screaming or becoming incoherent, which only intensified the spectacle. And then there was the final cruelty, returning home. Many arrived at their doors to find themselves locked out. Husbands refused to take them back. Children were told not to speak to them. Neighbors had already claimed their belongings. And even after the ritual ended, the punishment followed them for life. Women marked by this ordeal were denied work, denied remarriage, and given segregated seating in church. One Parisian record describes a woman who, 15 years later, was still insulted on the street. This was engineered social death, and horrifyingly, it was considered the lenient response. When an accusation was serious, or when people wanted a definitive answer, the system turned to something far more dangerous: trial by ordeal. To us, the phrase sounds barbaric. To medieval Europeans, it was the highest form of divine justice. They believed completely that God would protect the innocent. The most common ordeal for accused adulteresses was the cold water test, and the logic behind it, while twisted, was shockingly well structured. The water was blessed, sometimes taken from the baptismal font. Because baptism symbolized purity, the belief was that sacred water would accept the innocent and reject the sinful. At dawn, the accused woman was brought to a river, pond, or purpose-built pool. The entire village was required to attend, once again by law. The ordeal was not only a test, it was a performance, a public reinforcement of the social order. A priest would begin the ritual with a long ceremony, blessing the water and asking God to reveal the truth. The woman was reduced to a thin shift, nothing more. Legal texts like the Saxon Spiegel describe exactly how she was then tied. Her right thumb bound to her left foot, her left thumb tied to her right foot, forcing her body into a twisted position that made swimming completely impossible. In some regions they added a rope around her waist, but not for protection. It was there so officials could pull her body back if she didn't survive the test. She would be thrown into the water or pushed to jump, while the entire village looked on. The physics behind this ordeal made it even more tragic. How a person floats or sinks depends on so many things: body fat, breath control, water temperature, panic. A terrified woman breathing fast might stay at the surface for a moment, and if she floated, she was declared guilty, rejected by the blessed water, then immediately punished, sometimes without even leaving the riverbank. If she sank, she was considered innocent, accepted by the water. But sinking while bound meant she was helpless. She couldn't move, couldn't fight her way up, couldn't breathe. The people supervising the ordeal varied wildly in how long they waited before lifting her out. Some pulled her up after a short moment. Others insisted on completing a full prayer, which could take several minutes. One recorded case from England in 1194 describes a woman named Edgith, accused by her husband's brother. When she was thrown into the water, she went under instantly. She was eventually pulled out alive, but badly injured from lack of oxygen. She was pronounced innocent. She also suffered severe brain damage and died 3 days later. The record states her husband received permission to bury her in consecrated ground because she had passed God's test. Imagine the emotional torture of this. You're told that your fate rests entirely in God's hands, yet either outcome could kill you. If you drowned, did heaven abandon you? If you floated and were executed, did that mean you were condemned? It created a kind of spiritual terror that people lived with for the rest of their lives. And water wasn't the only ordeal. In many regions, women were subjected to the hot iron trial. They had to carry a heated piece of iron for a set distance, often 9 steps. Their hands were then wrapped, and after 3 days the bandages were removed. If the burn marks looked like they were healing smoothly, the woman was declared innocent. If they appeared infected, and medieval hygiene made that almost impossible to avoid, she was guilty. A 12th century account from Bavaria tells of a woman who begged to confess rather than face this test. She was told a confession without ordeal meant a harsher sentence, including disfigurement. She chose the iron. Her burns became so badly infected that her hands were removed to save her life. She still died soon afterward. Because the wounds were infected, the court ruled her guilty and denied her a proper burial. There's a dark twist in the history of these rituals. In 1215, the Catholic Church officially banned ordeals, not because they were cruel, but because church leaders argued that expecting God to intervene on command was theologically inappropriate. They believed it was disrespectful to demand a miracle. The suffering of the accused wasn't mentioned in the reasoning. Even so, the practice lingered in some areas for decades, sometimes renamed as tests rather than sacred judgments. The tragedies continued. Women drowned, burned, or collapsed, and communities told themselves they had witnessed justice. As terrible as these ordeals were, there were punishments designed not just to risk death, but to ensure a fate far more prolonged, survival marked by humiliation that lasted a lifetime. Medieval society was obsessed with visible permanent signs. In a world where most people couldn't read, where official records were rare, where identity depended on physical appearance, marking someone's body became the ultimate form of documentation. For women accused of adultery, the marking was meant to ensure no one ever forgot the accusation. Some of the laws were blunt and shocking. Early 11th century codes under King Snut, enforced in England and parts of Scandinavia, stated plainly that an adulterous woman shall have her nose and ears removed, not as an alternative punishment, as the punishment. Historical descriptions show how these sentences were carried out. The woman was brought into a public space, sometimes tied to a post, sometimes held down. The cutting was done by a blacksmith or a barber, people accustomed to sharp tools and steady hands. There was no pain relief of any kind. In some areas, giving her something to bite was even prohibited because officials wanted the crowd to hear her cries. The injuries left her permanently marked, instantly recognizable. Chroniclers avoided disturbing detail, but they consistently note that communities gathered and watched, understanding exactly what the punishment meant. One case from 1231 in a German town describes a woman named Gertrude, accused by her husband of being unfaithful with a traveling merchant. She denied everything. The only testimony against her came from a single neighbor who said he saw them speaking privately. Under local law, this was enough to convict her. The sentence was carried out publicly. The record mentions, almost casually, that her 3 young children stood nearby. The youngest wept for days afterward. Gertrude survived the immediate ordeal, but her life effectively ended. Her husband was granted an instant divorce. No trade would hire her. People avoided her in the street. Her altered appearance frightened others and made begging impossible. Within months, she was found lifeless outside the town, likely from hunger or exposure. No investigation followed. The law considered the matter closed. But even this wasn't simply about punishing one individual. It was meant to send a message to every woman watching. It etched fear into the community, creating a visible reminder of what happened to anyone who broke, or was suspected of breaking, the rules placed upon them. Every woman who endured these punishments became a living reminder to everyone around her. She walked through her community carrying a message on her body, proof of what happened to women accused of breaking the rules of marriage. The injuries were so recognizable that anyone who saw her immediately knew the accusation. There was no chance to move away, start fresh, or hide from her past. The sentence followed her everywhere for the rest of her life. Different regions had their own versions of these marks. Some cities in Italy used heated irons to brand women across the cheek or forehead, usually with the letter A. Certain courts in France ordered women's hair to be cut away, and, in extreme cases, even forced silence on them if they protested too loudly. And although these punishments didn't always take a life immediately, many women didn't survive long afterward. In a world without knowledge of infection or sterilization, wounds often turned dangerous. A simple fever could grow worse each day until it overwhelmed the body. When this happened, the law didn't see it as an execution. It was simply considered the natural outcome of her sentence. Records from medieval towns even show payments to the people who carried out these punishments. They were paid according to a list of fees, almost like line items in an account book. A town in Flanders recorded specific amounts for each injury, as if it were ordinary paperwork. It showed how deeply normalized this violence had become. But even this wasn't the harshest punishment available. These marks were largely inflicted on women with little social power. For women from influential families, medieval courts had a different strategy, one aimed at slowly erasing a person over months, years, or even decades. A famous example comes from 1314 during one of France's greatest political scandals, often called the Tour de Nesle affair. Two noble women, Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy, were accused of being involved with men outside their marriages. Historians still debate how strong the evidence actually was. Their male companions were killed publicly in ways meant to warn others, but Margaret and Blanche were given a sentence meant to break them over time: lifelong confinement. Descriptions from the period say Margaret was locked inside a tower chamber, prepared specifically to hold her indefinitely. The room was small, enclosed in thick stone, with a single narrow window too high to reach. The door had one small opening near the floor for her meals. She saw no visitors, received no letters, and was given no information about the outside world. She had no access to books or writing materials. Her life became a cycle of silence, dim light, and waiting for the daily ration of food. After 8 years, she died, officially of natural causes, though modern historians believe her health failed under the psychological strain, the lack of care, or possibly despair. Blanche endured even longer, spending more than a decade in confinement before being moved to a convent where she lived the rest of her life still under supervision. By the time she passed away, she had spent more years in captivity than she had lived freely as an adult. And these royal punishments were considered the softer versions. When similar sentences were given to women of lower status, conditions were far more severe. One documented practice, used only in the harshest cases, was a form of confinement known as immurement, being shut inside a tiny space with the entrance sealed afterward. The woman was placed in a chamber barely large enough to sit or curl up in. The opening was then sealed with masonry, leaving only a narrow gap so food could be pushed through. She would remain in this space for the remainder of her life. Some survived for years, some lasted longer. Each day was spent in a kind of living grave. A record from Barcelona in 1357 describes a woman named Maria who faced this punishment. Her chamber, built into a section of the city wall, was so small she could not lie fully flat. The chronicle doesn't describe her end, only that she remained there until she died, her existence quietly fading behind stone. She survived in that cramped stone cell for 9 years before her death. The records say people could hear her cries for months and then nothing, just a long, suffocating silence. When authorities finally opened the chamber to take out her body, they found the walls covered in scratches. She had carved messages into the stone with her own fingernails, worn down until they bled. Most of what she wrote were desperate prayers and bitter curses. The psychological collapse that comes from this level of isolation is something modern science is only beginning to understand. Today, spending more than 15 days alone in solitary confinement is considered a form of torture by international human rights groups. These women endured not days, but months, years, and in some cases, most of their lives. And what makes it even more twisted is that this was described as an act of mercy. Officials claimed it gave the woman time to reflect, to repent, to prepare her soul before death. Her suffering was framed as spiritual cleansing. Some priests even said she should feel fortunate to have the chance to sit alone and think about her sins. Many of these women lost their sanity. Chroniclers describe prisoners who stopped eating, who smashed their heads against the walls, who muttered nonsense whenever food was pushed toward them. But there was no treatment, no help, no acknowledgement of psychological collapse. Madness was written off as possession, punishment, or simply the final stage of repentance. Their silence was intentional. These were women who had once been visible in their communities. Some even held influence or status. Imprisonment didn't just remove them from society, it erased them from the record entirely. Many weren't allowed proper burials. Some had their names removed from family documents. Their identities were scrubbed from history. They became ghosts of people who once existed. And all of this, every mutilation, every drowning, every public humiliation, every slow, suffocating death, came from the same legal system